3, which brings together leading artists, writers and thinkers. If you enjoy what you hear, do subscribe to the Arts and Ideas podcast, and wherever you get your podcasts from, do rate and review us. It'll help other people to find us. He is the most influential public intellectual in the West right now. He is a fascist mystic. Just 2 verdicts on this controversial figure. An interview with him on Channel 4 News found 6 million viewers, and unlike the usual intellectual, he's more likely to be encountered on the internet and on social media than in print. His book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, published earlier this year, is only his second in 20 years, even if a bestseller across numerous countries. My guest in Extended Conversation this evening is Jordan B. Peterson, a Canadian academic and clinical psychologist who initially rose to fame when he refused to use gender-neutral pronouns, the consequence of a Canadian anti-discrimination law. More recently, he's become centre stage in the culture wars, defending the traditional family, the need for men to be tough, hierarchy and much else. Dostoevsky, the Bible, Hobbes and his own experience as parent and clinical psychologist motor his arguments in 12 Rules of Life, which is largely addressed to young men. Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Make friends with people who want the best for you. These are just 3 of his rules. Jordan Peterson joins me now. You're clearly involved centrally in the culture wars. Were you drafted into these wars, or were you a volunteer?
I would say a little of column A and a little of column B, but mostly I volunteered.
Why?
Because the government stepped outside of its mandate and dared to bring in legislation compelling speech. And that had never been done in the history of British common law. And they did it in the guise of a false compassion and in ignorance and in willful blindness. They made a big mistake. And so there's no way, once I had read the policies and understood what was happening, that I was going to stand for that, insofar as I had any choice.
It's the case, though, that common courtesy leads us to address people in ways that they feel easy with. You're happy with that as an account?
Sure, and thrilled with common courtesy. But it's a whole different thing when the government uses an ideologically motivated claim of compassion to justify implementing careless, unbelievably careless compelled speech legislation.
But you're not against the state's intervention in all areas of life, are you?
Well, it depends on the areas.
No, but in principle, I mean, there are some.
No.
You're not an Oklahoma guy who wants to go back into the woods and get rid of the state.
No, I'm actually quite a moderate, centrist type of person. So,
okay, listen.
I mean, I'm from Western Canada, and we're a little more on the libertarian end of things, but not in any. I'm a Canadian, you know. Canadian political radicals are just not that common.
Your book is marinated in religious language.
Yes.
Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. That's got the cadences of the Bible behind it about setting your house in order. I was brought up an English Methodist. I want to know, what is your religious framework? I'm just back from New York, so you're clearly a North American Protestant.
Yes, I think that's very fair to say. That's my background. My family was a member of my mother in particular was a member of the mainstream Protestant church in Canada, which happened to be the United Church. Although I was disenchanted with religious thinking by the time I was about 12 or 13. It's not that there's anything special about that, but I became very much interested in the role that narrative plays in orienting people in life, and delved deep into it when I was studying totalitarianism, and which I did in depth. Well, I have been doing that for 40 years, really. And that led me down to the deepest of stories. And by definition, the deepest of stories are religious. I mean, it's the fact that they're deep that makes them religious, or vice versa. And so I've strived to understand what those stories mean.
Okay, that makes it sound very scholarly. Mm-hmm. It's not with you. It's inside you. It's not you are religious, aren't you?
Well, it would depend to some degree.
No, don't get epistemological on me. Okay, what I'm asking you is, you're a believer now. Of course, what it means to believe is different. But the reason I'm interested in this is your commitment to individual responsibility has a religious history to it.
It has a religious aspect to it, sure. It has a religious layer to it, let's say. And I would say that the battle that I found myself involved in wasn't a political battle or even a psychological battle. As far as I'm concerned, it's actually a theological battle. So because I see what's happening in the universities as the pushback of a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint against the cardinal Western stance that the individual is sovereign. And
hold on there. That's where we begin. There is, of course, Emerson's great essay on self-reliance, Frank Sinatra's My Way. America has the deepest belief in the individual, at least one strand of American thought, but that doesn't exhaust the West. There are lots more communal versions of life. In fact, one of the things I would have said, and I'm not a Christian now, one of the things I would have said about Christianity is it believes in the communal and in the collective. That's why people go to church.
Well, I would say it believes in the proper relationship between the individual and the collective, not that it believes in the collective. And I mean, and I think I'm fully in that tradition, because I think that the way that you want to orient yourself in life is to set yourself up so that you're taking care of yourself properly, but so that you're doing it in a manner that benefits your family and your community, and that all of those levels of organization have to be serving one another, and that they can.
Now, I understand that, and that's a perfectly reasonable position, but it mustn't be conflated with the Western view is the individual is primary, because that's historically not the case.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that the emphasis on the idea of the logos in the West and the fact that individuals are regarded in some sense as the carriers of that does make the individual primary from a conceptual perspective. Because one of the questions is...
But Catholicism doesn't even believe in that. Catholicism, one of the founding forms of Christianity in the West, that doesn't believe in this wonderful American Protestant view of yours.
Well, why would you say that belief isn't held? Because of the emphasis on the importance of the church?
Because you can only survive, you can only go to heaven through the church. It's communal, it's collective. Let me give you an example. You and I are both old enough to have watched Spartacus, the Stanley Kubrick novel. There's a Stanley Kubrick film. There's a great moment in there when Kirk Douglas
the Christian belief systems along a spectrum, you'd see that the Protestants are more individualistic than the Catholics. I'm certainly willing to grant you that. But I still think that the idea that the individual is to be regarded as of paramount importance with regards to such doctrines as the salvation of the individual soul and the, let's say, the internal value of the soul is still something that puts the individual in a sovereign position conceptually. And so that doesn't eliminate the importance of the collective in the least, because it is also very much about balance. You could say that the kingdom of God is within you and without you, outside of you, at the same time. And I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it, because it's a matter of harmony.
No, but forgive me, but you don't say that. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You're giving priority to an internal transformation. Now, one response to that is, why can't you do both at the same time? Set your own house in order and set the world's house in order at the same time.
That's a good question. I think it's because
but that's not what you say.
No, and it's not something I agree with. I think the reason for that fundamentally is because this is partly because of my training as a social scientist, is that the first thing you want to do is the least amount of harm possible. And if you put your own house in order, the probability that you're going to bring grief to the world is very, very low. Whereas if you start meddling in the function of higher order systems, especially when you don't understand them, the probability that you'll translate your good intentions into proper outcome is very, very low.
Okay, let me give you back a historical sociological example. Let's just imagine you'd have had the opportunity to talk to Martin Luther King. And you'd have said, don't go on those civil rights marches until you sort out your personal ethics, you wouldn't have gone down that route, would you? What Martin Luther King did, and not only Martin Luther King, because you quote Tolstoy, and Tolstoy in War and Peace is endlessly meditating. Does, as it were, Napoleon get pushed across the Rubicon by the troops, or does he lead the troops? These are historiographical arguments. But actually, you can't wait to set your own house in perfect order, because we're dead before that happens. And second, civil rights wouldn't have happened on your principle.
Well, I don't know if it's reasonable to view what might be true for exceptional individuals as something that should be made the common norm. Like what I was objecting to in that chapter were two things, I guess. One was the proclivity of universities to teach 18-year-old and 19-year-old people that their primary obligation is to be an activist for sociological transformation in the world, which I think is a dreadful mistake.
It's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students, or it's a dreadful mistake?
No, it's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students. They have more proximal things to attend to, and they don't know anything. They seriously don't know anything. And so...
Yeah, they do know things. Come on, 18-year-olds do know things. You've got children, I've got children. Both of them are older than 18 now. I wouldn't have liked to sit opposite my 18-year-old and tell them they didn't know anything.
Well, they know enough to put certain things immediately in front of them in order and to attend to their education, but they don't know enough to risk experimenting with large-scale transformations of economic systems that they don't understand in the least.
Okay.
No, not that that's the case for many people. And the other problem with the activist ethos, which is partly what I was objecting to, is that it's very easy for your bitterness to manifest itself as the hypothetically altruistic desire for social change. And I think that happens far more often than people are willing to admit. And so partly you have to wonder if you're attempting to change the world, because you don't want to do the changes that are necessary for yourself.
You do increasingly sound to me like a good radical Protestant, but I want to give you another example, which is different. You know, if you'd have said set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world when you're 18 and universities, it might have been a more defensible thing to say. But let me give you another example. There's a football match where 90-odd people died from Liverpool. The claim at the beginning was they were badly behaved hooligans, and the police blamed these Liverpool supporters for doing this. The mothers, the fathers, the sons, the brothers, the wives got together and became activists. It took them 25 years to demonstrate actually that what the police had claimed was untrue. Now, they were not going for vengeance.
Right.
They were going for justice. And actually, I really read this book carefully.
Yeah, it
and
seems
the word,
that way.
And the word justice is really not much there. The word vengeance, that's why I think you're an old-fashioned Old Testament guy. The word justice is hardly the word. Vengeance is very prominent in the book. Now, I'm telling you that these Hillsborough families were after justice, not after vengeance. They acted collectively. They didn't know enough.
No, they had their personal reasons. It was part of their own destiny. Fair enough.
And they were after justice.
Well, and I'm not going to make the case that collective action is never necessary. I mean, and as I said, I wrote the book in some sense as an antidote. The prevailing ethos is that the highest order of being is political activism, and that's especially the case in the universities. And so, now and then things need to be pushed back into their proper position. So it's not like political action or the desire for justice, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is never justified. Of course it is.
And
but it's also difficult to discriminate it from revenge. So
no, yes and no is the response to that. Vengeance is personal, it's self-interested. Justice is about vindication rather than vindictiveness.
Yeah, right.
And if that's the case, then you can separate out justice from vengeance. And to be frank, there's no reason an 18-year-old, and there were plenty of 18-year-olds amongst these Hillsborough families, shouldn't be active. And there's a kind of quietism about you which actually surprises me.
Well, I don't want to make the case, or to be seen to making the case, that action at some level other than the psychological is never warranted, because obviously that's not the case. But I would say that we have quite self-evidently swung way too far in the opposite direction.
Who's we?
The universities. the social sciences, the humanities in particular, women's studies, cultural studies,
so
these groups that do nothing but produce activists?
Forgive me, I was a professor of literature, so that's simple historical and factual nonsense. I mean, if universities were turning out social activists in very large numbers, it is a fight that's going on. It is a fight in the university. But I suppose what I'm asking...
How long ago were you a professor?
I've been a visiting professor quite recently, until I turned to the wonderful age of 65 when I stopped being a professor. But the point I suppose I'm trying to ask you about, there are injustices in the world. Mm-hmm. And because there are injustices in the world, you may think, and you may in certain ways be right, that the ways in which these social activists operate is not helpful. But by addressing them rather than the problems, you're avoiding the major issues, which are issues of injustice.
Well, it depends on what you think the major issues are. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the major issues are whether or not people have put their houses in order. And like you see the world, apparently, and fair enough, I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. It's not how I look at the world. You know, you, at least in the way that you're expressing it in this argument, is you see large-scale collective injustices and regard it as people's fundamental, what I suppose...
No. Listen, I wouldn't dream to speak for Martin Luther King or even for the Hillsborough survivors. What I'm saying is, historically and in contemporary terms, there are people who've taken other views that can't be reduced to they want vengeance. They want justice. The book doesn't recognise those other positions. The book tends to reduce university, or rather she couldn't get a degree. Women have been excluded in all kinds of ways from social situations, have they not?
Yes, but people have been excluded from social situations in all kinds of ways. And I don't like the narrative, the social historical injustice narrative as a way of looking at the world. The way that young people now are taught about the relationships between men and women throughout history is that the fundamental narrative is that men oppressed women throughout the course of history. And then that kind of came to an end when everybody woke up in 1964.
No.
Yeah, really. That's really it.
No, listen, I don't know what it's like in Canadian universities, but that's what I call, and forgive this European reference, that's a kind of Punch and Judy way of seeing it. That is not how universities as a whole operate.
Well, that's how they operate in Canada. We had the biggest scandal in Canadian university history last year when a graduate student was hauled in front of a Maoist Inquisition for daring to show a 5-minute video of me discussing issues like this on public television. The universities are in far worse shape. Maybe they're not in such bad shape in the UK as they are in North America, but they're in plenty bad shape in North America.
Forgive me, and I'm sorry you were involved, but that is not the biggest scandal. The biggest scandal will be the number, for instance, of suicides that are prevalent amongst undergraduates. The fact that one academic was hauled up, in my view, inappropriately for doing what was done is not the biggest scandal. You're inflating
things. It's not the biggest tragedy. The suicides are a bigger tragedy, but it was certainly the biggest scandal. Canadian universities don't make international news, and that was international news for about 3 months. And the university apologized and set up a free speech commission. It was plenty scandalous, and it was diagnostic as well. It wasn't an aberration. It was precisely what's going on in the Canadian universities.
Okay. So we're back to a situation where what you're proposing is simply restricted to the universities, and not only restricted...
spreading into wider society at a very rapid rate. In fact, the National Science Foundation in the United States is now thinking about imposing gender and ethnicity quotas on the STEM fields in the U.S., which is an absolute catastrophe. I think you're radically underestimating the danger that these collectivist disciplines present to our culture. I really believe that.
No, and I know you do. And what I'm arguing is that's inflating small parochial, and I use the word parochial descriptively, not abusively. It's inflating small parochial arguments, whereas there are bigger arguments, and those bigger arguments are collective not because I think they're collective or because I believe in them, but whether it's the Hillsborough people nailing the police or whether it's Martin Luther King on civil rights, those are really changing people. Let me give you another example. You and I were both brought up in provincial places. Mm-hmm. I was brought up in a mining village that when the mines closed down, it meant that unemployment suddenly became 60%.
Right.
Heroin moved in because heroin dealers know what to do with people who have got little money and they need to get them hooked. Crime rose 20% above the national average. It was the poorest village in Britain. Those are major, major issues of social justice. The arguments that are going on within the university pale, don't they, in relationship to those catastrophes?
Well, sure. I mean, there are truly terrible things going on all over the world.
But shouldn't one address those rather than addressing the social warrior people who strike me as small-scale parochial battles within a small-scale parochial world?
Well, I guess it depends on how you push things out forward into the future. You know, my sense was, well, I told you what my sense was with regards to the Federal Governments Act. It was that, no, the government doesn't get to compel speech. It's not part of the English common law tradition, and it's a line that shouldn't be crossed. So that was my decision. And the reason I decided that was because I thought that the danger of that propagating forward was extremely high. With regards to what's happening in the universities, I think that the universities have already compromised undergraduate education to a degree that's actually probably not restorable, not in the foreseeable future. That they're charging way too much money for the privilege of doing so, and that they are corrupting the rest of society with talk of such things as implicit bias, which is an absolute pseudoscientific scandal.
All right. And you've gone back and you've got angry because I can see this makes you...
That really does irritate me because I know the IAT literature.
Okay. But it does mean that you've sidestepped the larger inequalities that exist amongst the poor and the rich.
I haven't sidestepped it. I just don't know what to do about it.
Well, then, you're as the English say, an understatement. You're not a stupid man, so put your attention on those things.
I have. I talk about inequality all the time in my public talks.
Okay, but
and
not
in this book as well.
No.
Yeah, I talk about the inequality in Chapter 1 when I talk about the downside of hierarchies and Price's law. And Price's law dictates that in a hierarchy, most people will stack up at zero. And that's a terrible thing. And that's the existence for the left, reason for the existence of the left.
And what should be done about it?
Good question.
No,
there's a new book out by a man named Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. And he did an empirical analysis of the relationship between inequality and governments distributed among the ideological spectrum. There's no evidence whatsoever that left-wing governments are any more effective at reducing inequality than right-wing governments. The only thing he saw in his empirical analysis that permanently reduced inequality was war and pestilence. We don't know what to do about it. That doesn't mean it's not a terrible problem. It's clearly a terrible problem. And one of the things I outlined in Chapter 1 was the fact that if you happen to be one of the people who stack up at zero in a hierarchy, which is the most common place to be, that's going to be very hard on you psychophysiologically. And I believe that the left has a perfectly valid place in giving the dispossessed in any given hierarchical structure a political voice. And I think they're abandoning that with their concentration on identity politics.
All right, let me tell you why I think you're not doing what you think you're doing. All right, and you analyse briefly Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and you mention that great unnamed narrator who has, as far as I remember, sex with the prostitute, with Lisa, who's going to become a prostitute, and then he messes her up by promising her all kinds of things that he then doesn't deliver. And your conclusion from that is you have to be careful of trying to help people, because often it's more about yourself than it is about those who you helped. I read Dostoevsky in an entirely different way. It's a man, a self-obsessed man, trying to help a dispossessed woman. And the mockery is about the man. I don't think the conclusion you can draw from that is you shouldn't show solidarity with people, which is in effect conclusion you shouldn't
attempt to self-aggrandize at the expense of people that you're trying to help.
That happens
all the time.
Do you believe in solidarity?
I don't know exactly what you mean by
the solidarity of Spartacus and everyone in the rooms and everyone standing up and saying, I'm Spartacus. Those are people acting and believing collectively. I'm not sure in the end you think collective action is important, is valuable. It's only valuable after one's sorted out one's own internal
I think
life.
there's far too much emphasis on the ethos of collective action now, especially among the people who teach our young people. It's all collectivist action, and the issue is, and the worldview that's being promoted is a worldview that's essentially collectivist in its fundamental aspect too, which I think is extraordinarily dangerous. That postmodern types, all they talk about is ethnicity and sex and gender identity, as if those are the hallmarks of the individual, and I don't believe they are.
Okay, but it isn't the case, is it, that, for instance, and we go back to this, that women or people from what we call BMEs, black and minority ethnic, are not excluded or...
Women, well, it's not so obvious.
No, it was for a time they were excluded from getting degrees in university. Then they were allowed.
That's a long time ago, and it's certainly not the case with computer science, even though they're radically underrepresented in that
Forgive
discipline.
me, it's not a long time ago. A long time ago is 2,000 years.
Okay, sorry, it's a long time
years.
ago compared to the 1980s.
Okay, all right, but we don't want to get stuck that the world began in the 1980s. But let's give you another example. It looks as if when women enter professions, actually they diminish the money they get, as it were, is reduced. In other words, women-centred professions are often paid less well than male-centred professions. In courts of law, at least in Britain, in courts of law, black people get incarcerated for longer for the same kind of offence.
Yes, that happens in the United States as well.
So there are problems of power and
Of course.
disparity.
Of course there are, and hierarchies tend towards tyranny, and there has to be, you have to have your eyes open against that all the time.
But
the
why-
mere fact that I described hierarchies in chapter 1 doesn't mean I'm justifying them. I understand what the risks of hierarchies are. In fact, I understand them very well because I'm aware of Price's law, and I know that when you put a hierarchy together, that people stack up at the bottom. But I also know that you have to have hierarchies because otherwise people don't have anything to work for, and we have no structure. So you need a right wing.
Wait a minute. Of course we need structures. The question is whether the structures we have are right. It was George Bernard Shaw, that difficult Irishman, who famously said, it's not our disorder that's a problem, it's our order. So,
Well, our order is a problem. The disorder is also a problem.
no, for Shaw, it was the problem. So there's no point in you proposing structures as necessary without asking the second question, what kinds of structures?
I do ask the second question.
I'm not aware.
Well, then I don't think that you read the book very carefully because I emphasize the fact that the proper place to stand is on the border between chaos and order, not in order. And I know that...
Forgive me, you don't do that, because the title of the book is An Antidote to Chaos. Now, an antidote, you only have an antidote if you've been poisoned. Okay, so at that level...
Yeah, well, we have too much chaos at the moment.
Oh, well, no.
So,
But an antidote to chaos doesn't say that. An antidote to chaos makes chaos bad. Okay?
it makes an excess of chaos bad.
No, forgive me. You can't have an excess of cholera. You can't have an excess of TB. You can't have an excess of pneumonia. An antidote to chaos. It may be the book is more subtle than that, but the title of the book...
No, the book is more subtle than that.
Okay, well then, forgive me, but why did you...
together for a reason.
Which
because
is...
too many people suffer now from an excess of chaos. You talked about suicide, for example. Well, that's depression and nihilism. That's anxiety. That's an excess of chaos, technically speaking.
No,
and
technically speaking, it's not an excess of chaos. There are many ways of describing it, and chaos isn't one of them.
Yes, technically speaking, it is, because the hemisphere that is involved in the production of negative emotion is precisely the hemisphere that deals with the unexpected and the uncertain.
Okay,
and to be
but-
overwhelmed by that is to be overwhelmed by chaos.
But let's
and that
im-
leads to depression and suicide.
Okay, let's imagine that rather than the word chaos, because you also identify the chaos with the feminine.
I don't. I just draw on literature
Okay.
that makes that case.
Well, you could have drawn on that literature and critiqued that literature. Since
I don't think it's worth critiquing. I think it's accurate. I
Well,
think
then,
it is
so-
the way
so-
that it's portrayed. But that chaos is also very positive. The unexpected is very positive. The
well, no,
anomalous is
forgive me,
positive.
it would have been different if you'd have said order and adventure, order and newness. Chaos, you quote Milton, so you know where it comes from. Chaos is a negative term.
It's also that which God constructed order out of at the beginning of time. It's not only a negative term.
Well,
and I don't see it only as a negative term.
Forgive me, but if it is, it's only useful chaos when God is constructing order out of it, which means men constructing order out of female chaos.
It doesn't mean men, because men and women are made in the image of God. That's not a proposition that's part of that story.
No, but it is, because you say that order is masculine and chaos is feminine, which means the masculine shapes the feminine. That's what you say in the book.
It also means that the feminine takes down the masculine. There's no disproportion in power.
Yes,
And then
there
you
is,
want them to
because
be
if
balanced.
if the primary is order shaping order out of chaos, then the masculine is primary.
No, the chaos is there too. And in the mythological representation, there's three elements. There's the chaos, there's the order, and there's the factor that mediates between the two. And they're all equally primary. They're equally primary.
Not in the biblical story, which you quote over and over again. God creates order out of chaos.
Well, but the chaos is there.
No, of course the chaos is there, but it needs to be ordered, which means the feminine needs to be ordered.
It needs to be ordered before there's something that habitable that can emerge. And that is the case.
And you think that's the case in gender terms too?
Well, symbolically speaking.
Now, forget symbolically speaking. Is it?
You can't forget it, because I used masculine and feminine symbolically.
No.
I made the case that the reason we use those categories is because those are our primary social cognitive categories, and we've used them to explain the rest of the world.
No. There are many other ways of explaining the world. There are many other ways of explaining the relationship between order and chaos that don't rely on gender. I spend a lot of time in China, and there's a lot of different cultural ways of doing it. This is
There's a very deep emphasis on exactly the same thing in Taoism, and the same division between masculine and feminine.
But not in Buddhism, and not in all kinds of religions.
In Buddhism as well. In Buddhism as well, you see the same thing in the story of the Buddha, where he's raised in the orderly city, surrounded by chaos. It has a feminine tilt from a symbolic perspective.
Okay, well, listen, let's not go there, because we'll get lost in that. I suppose what I'm searching for is some account that recognises the inequalities. And what you're telling me is the response to that is feminine and masculine are both necessary.
And equally valuable.
But equally valuable, but different.
Well, let's distinguish two things. I do believe that there are biological differences between men and women, both physically and temperamentally.
The first part of that is given. The second part is, to put it mildly, it's not controversial, it's just contestable.
I don't think it is. I think the
data
are quite
contestable.
Clear. Well, in what way is it contestable?
Historically.
There's been 35 years of investigation, scientific investigation into temperament, and the primarily left-leaning scientists who've been investigating that have concluded quite clearly that men and women do differ temperamentally, although they're more similar than they are different. The differences are relevant and are very important in determining such things as career choice.
The odd bit about your position from where I stand is you're committed to tradition. Your tradition committed to the individual, but the economic order is committed to unravelling all those things. I know Marx is not your favourite
piece of reading. Put it mildly.
No, it is. But in the 19th century, he did say, all that is solid melts into thin air. And that's what capital is doing. It's unravelling most of the things that you believe in. And your view that it's the social warriors who are doing that rather than capitalism strikes me you're missing the major feature.
Now we're getting down to brass tacks. Well, the problem with leftist critique of capitalism is that the leftists put inequality at the feet of capitalism, and that's an
No, I didn't speak about. I spoke of unravelling the things that matter to you.
Okay, well, I guess I misunderstood. In what way do you feel that the capitalist ethos
because
is
when
unraveling?
you say, here's a good example, men get out of work. Drugs, which is a global issue, move into communities. These things begun to unravel the things that you care about. But instead of addressing those, you address social warriors who will be here today, gone tomorrow, likely.
Well, I addressed those too. I wrote a whole thesis on alcoholism, you know.
Well,
And
forgive me,
I
that
have
I
a whole
haven't.
literature
Okay.
on drug and alcohol abuse
Okay.
and antisocial behavior and inequality. So I've addressed that plenty, and also in my clinical work.
But then if you have, why are those issues, these wider issues of the breakup of the family, why are they not addressed?
Because I think that the collectivist viewpoint that's being pushed forward by the postmodern neo-Marxists presents a real danger to the integrity of our society.
But let's give you an example. Let's take family.
It's happened before. It happened in the 20th century multiple times that viewpoint was devastating. And I see it coming back in tremendous force. And so I'm not happy about that. And I might be wrong about my prognostications for the future. And you could be right that there are more pressing issues that need to be attended to. It's certainly possible that I have my focus, that I'm focused improperly. But I've staked my position and I've watched what's happened in the universities. And I'm not a fan of the collectivists. I think they're making a dreadful error.
Okay, okay, let me give you some more figures. And I want to stay with this issue of single-parent families. You know, they're around in Britain, forgive me, I don't know the Canadian figures, there are around 2 million people subject to domestic abuse. 70% of those are women. 35% of all violent crime is domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. There may well be reasons other than the social warriors and the neo-post-structuralist
biggest
Marxists.
reason is alcohol, actually.
Well, but then these are issues that need to be addressed at a level not in terms of the social warriors, but in terms, why are men beating up women?
Mostly because they're drunk. It's the biggest single contributor to domestic violence.
But why when women get drunk, do they not beat
They
up?
do.
themselves?
They just don't use lethal force.
No.
In fact, women are more likely to hit their husbands than the reverse. The literature on domestic violence is crystal clear.
No, not in Britain it isn't.
Yes, it
because
is.
Forgive me, I've just read it.
Well, what did you read? Because I know the epidemiological studies.
I've just read the government research on this.
On what, though?
On domestic violence, and 70% of domestic violence, domestic abuse, is male on female.
Yes, but
not lethal, which is a different. Lethal is killing somebody.
Yes. If you look at the number of times that a person in a relationship hits the other person, women do it more than men. The problem is, men are much stronger and they're much more likely to use harmful force. That's part of what accounts for the abuse, and very much of that is fueled by alcohol. And so if we were really serious about reducing domestic abuse and reducing campus rape, for example, we'd be very concerned about the effect of alcohol. We're not.
But so you do, not you, one does have to address larger social issues.
Well, as I said,
advertising, of promotion, of cheap liquor, of, to use a word that you're not fond of capital.
I'm not so sure about the latter one, but the former ones for sure. I mean, like I said, I studied alcoholism and drug abuse for decades. I have many publications on them aimed at ameliorating the consequences, particularly of alcohol use, because of all the drugs that people abuse, alcohol has the most pernicious social effects. By far, 50% of the people who are involved in a violent altercation are either drunk as victims or as perpetrators. And it's the only drug that we know of that actually makes people more aggressive. So it's a terrible problem. But people decry the rates of domestic abuse and that sort of thing, but they're very bad at figuring out what to do about it. But the same thing happens on campuses with regards to campus rape.
But forgive me, but it is the case that people are figuring out what to do. That's why one of the reasons feminism was so important. It did found refuges. It did identify an issue that largely wasn't on the agenda. It has shaped laws. In those circumstances, you have to stand up for feminism, don't you?
I would be very careful about attributing those transformations to feminism.
No, I didn't.
Per se.
I didn't say they were to be attributed. It's not causal, but I did say they helped to identify them. They helped to ameliorate them through refuges, and they've helped. I didn't say they were causal. They have helped to get laws changed which protect women.
Well, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and claim that women who've acted on behalf of women in the social sphere have always been wrong. I mean, I'd have to include the suffragettes in that analysis. But I would certainly say that at the moment, the doctrine that we know of as feminism is doing far more harm than
But
good.
there are feminisms. There's no
True.
feminism. There are feminisms. So what you're actually attacking is just one form of many forms of feminism that are available in North America, never mind globally.
Well, they're sufficiently unattractive so that a pronounced minority of women in the UK identify as feminist. The feminism that I see as most rampant at the moment, let's say, has its roots in this postmodern neo-Marxist view that I'm not a fan of, and I think it does far more harm than good to women as well as men by insisting, among other things, that the only reason that there isn't equality of outcome for women is because of patriarchal oppression.
I want to comment, as we're drawing towards the close, as people like me say, to talk about what has brought you to this degree of prominence. I don't mean because you're on this programme, but I mean more generally. And I think it's partly because you've identified a constituency who feels neglected. And in fact, you've got an odd...
It's me, man, standing up for the oppressed.
No. That I don't believe, because that's when you sound like a bad 60s guy. But I do think, and Slavoj Žižek, a postmodernist Marxist, has spoken well of you.
And badly.
And badly, but also well. And he, in a sense, it's because what he's saying, you're addressing something that isn't addressed, which is, as it were, a crisis in masculinity. And that seems to me, you accept that large numbers of your readers are male, not exclusively, but large readers. What led you to be worried about manliness?
Well, it's more my viewers than my readers. And part of that is because 80% of people who watch YouTube happen to be men. So it's hard to segregate that general statistic from the specific statistics of my channel. Well, it isn't really that I'm concerned with men. I'm concerned with what's symbolically masculine. And that actually is different. I think that because we have this proclivity to view our current social structure through the lens of patriarchal tyranny, that we confuse attempts by people to take their proper place in that hierarchy as a consequence of the manifestation of their competence with the manifestation of power and tyranny, and that's tremendously demoralizing, especially to young men. Now, it doesn't seem to affect young women as much, and I think the reason for that... Why doesn't it?
No, why is it debilitating to men?
Well, because if you tell men who are trying to do their best in the world that all they're doing is manifesting the kind of behavior that led to a tyrannical patriarchy, you're not exactly encouraging them to do their best in the world.
Have we got any evidence that large swathes of men across America, Canada, or here for that matter, are themselves subject to those kinds of disquisitions?
Well, we have the evidence that they increasingly underperform women at every level of educational attainment. So that's not trivial.
No, but we can't draw from that a conclusion that the real reason they're not performing as well as they were performing is for this reason, because the reasons are always multifactorial, to use your language. So it isn't, there's no cause and effect between...
Well, there's a hypothetical cause and effect, but it's not proven, to your point.
And if it's not proven, forgive me for using an English phrase, why bang on about it so much?
Because it actually matters to me that there's hordes of men and women as well, but we're talking about men who aren't doing well in the world. I'm a clinical psychologist. I mean, my goal is to help as many individuals as possible set their lives in order and live meaningful and productive lives so that they can tolerate the fact that life is suffering without becoming bitter and cruel. And so I think that the humble approach, generally speaking, towards the transformation of the world is to take stock of yourself and set your own iniquities right first. That's all. That doesn't mean you shouldn't act in the world. And sometimes you have to act in the world despite your imperfections, as you pointed out, often. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be your primary concern. I think they should be your primary concern.
You do sound like an evangelical Protestant.
Well, we're all stuck with what we are, I suppose, to some degree.
Jordan Peterson, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
That's all from me for tonight, and from my producer, Craig Smith. From both of us, good night. Thanks for listening. You can find more from our archives and further information about the guests and topics discussed by looking up the Free Thinking Programme website on BBC Radio 3. And if we've whetted your appetite for more discussions about arts and ideas, you might be interested in other BBC podcasts from Start the Week, Thinking Aloud and In Our Time.